Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab, all on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good afternoon. Welcome to CSIS. My name is Matthew Goodman. I'm Senior Vice President for Economics at CSIS. Delighted to have you with us for part 2 of our annual Asian Architecture Conference. We had a session on Tuesday on the East Asia Summit and related matters. And today we're going to look at the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, known as APEC. We've got a terrific lineup of speakers and panelists to follow in a moment. Hope you can stay with us through this conversation. APEC is an important little organization that it doesn't get much respect. I sometimes call it the Rodney Dangerfield of U.S. foreign policy, and that it doesn't get the respect it deserves. It's an important little organization that brings together 21 economies from around the Asia-Pacific region to discuss economic integration and trade and investment. And it's had quite an impact on expanding norms and best practices and leading to more formal rulemaking in the region and even around the world. So we think it's important to focus on it. The annual Economic Leaders Meeting of APEC will be held, officially be held in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, a week from Friday on the 20th of November. Obviously, it's going to be held in virtual format, but we thought it was important, as we do every year, to preview that. And so I'm particularly looking forward to the conversation about this year's leaders meeting. And particularly, just to put in a plug, I'm particularly interested in what's going to be discussed on the digital economy and the rulemaking, norm setting, best practices that are being discussed there. APEC's done a lot of work in this area over the years, and there's some really important issues around data governance, digital trade, and so forth, which I'm very much looking forward to hearing how that discussion is going to go forward this year. So with that, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Bill Reinsch. He's our Scholl Chair in International Business and is going to be overseeing today's event. So over to you, Bill.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you for kicking this off. Your comments were so complete that I really don't have much to add to that. I'm looking forward to the conversation. We have a very distinguished group of panelists and an opening keynoter that I think will be you'll all find really enlightening. And so let me just describe what we're going to do. I'm going to turn the podium, as it were, over in a few minutes to Deputy Assistant Secretary Oudkirk, who's going to make some keynote remarks. And then she's going to stay on and join the panel after she's done. So if you've got questions for her specifically, you'll have an opportunity to ask them when we get through the panel, because she'll be continuing. We will not have a separate Q&A session just for her after her remarks. Following her remarks, though, we are going to go to the panel, and I'll introduce them at the time so that we don't take up that space now. Let me also say that if you have questions, the way to submit them is to look at the event webpage or the event mailing that you received, and each of them has a box where you can click on and submit a question. If you do that, it will go through the ozone and multiple permutations, but it ends up in my chat box, and then I can put your question forward. So feel free to do that. We will reserve time for that once we've had some conversation with the panelists and once they've had a chance to make their remarks. So with that, let's begin, and let me introduce our keynote speaker, and it's a real honor for me to do so. She's really the primary government official on APEC. In fact, that's her title. This is Sandra Oudkirk, who is the U.S. senior official for APEC and the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific Islands. She's been a career member of the Foreign Service since 1991, has been in this bureau for several years. Immediately prior, she was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Energy Diplomacy in the Energy Bureau, and before that, She was the acting DAS for Threat Finance and Sanctions in the Bureau of Economics and Business Affairs. She's had foreign assignments in Taipei, in Ireland, in Turkey, in Jamaica, and Beijing, and a number of other positions in the State Department as well. So she is well-traveled in many sense of the words, and has, I think, a real good, deep and broad knowledge both of the department and of the issues, particularly in her region. And so I'm going to turn it over to Sandra to speak. And then, as I said, when she's done, we'll go on and I'll introduce the panel. So Sandra, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Bill. And good afternoon, everyone. I'm pleased to be here with all of you today. And I'd like to thank everyone for joining, and especially thank CSIS and NC-APEC for making this important event happen. This afternoon, I will outline U.S. priorities in the lead up to the APEC Leaders Week, which is next week, and some of the work that we've undertaken in APEC to respond to COVID-19. It has been a tough year for many, and APEC is no exception. But following a pause earlier this year when all economies were focused largely on pandemic response, we have worked hard to regain our momentum on APEC core priorities beyond response and recovery. So to talk first a bit about the calendar. Malaysia's host year will culminate next week during APEC's Leaders Week, which will include the joint ministerial meeting on November 16th, the CEO dialogues on November 19 to 20, and the leaders meeting on November 20, with all of these events being held virtually. And Monica Whaley, who's on the panel, I know will talk in some more detail about the CEO dialogues. But for the official events, leaders are expected to produce a declaration reflecting Malaysia's theme of optimizing human potential towards a resilient future of shared prosperity. Pivot, prioritize, progress. Leaders are also expected to endorse a new vision, which will guide APEC's work in the next decades. I will touch on the APEC post-2020 vision later in my remarks. Since I'm going to anticipate questions that I know I'm going to get, so I'll save you from having to type this into the chat box. I can confirm that for the joint ministerial, the State Department will be represented by Deputy Secretary of State Steve Biegun. USTR is still finalizing their participation, but will be represented, and we're still confirming our head of delegation for the leaders meeting. We are looking forward to a successful outcome this year at all of the high-level meetings during Leaders Week. So let's talk a bit about U.S. priorities. So I met with, I'm sure many of you earlier in the year, and when we started this year, we had a set of priorities, and they haven't pivoted that much, although Matt will be happy to hear there is an even greater focus on digital now than there was before, because the pandemic has really impressed upon everyone the key role that the digital economy plays in everyone's daily life. So since the spring, the United States, along with the rest of the APEC economies, has prioritized reorienting APEC's agenda towards economic recovery during and post-COVID-19. To that end, we have focused on minimizing disruptions and maintaining momentum on APEC's core work, such as trade in the digital economy, and the long-term work on improving the investment climate and regulatory environment. These efforts, along with APEC's work in supporting those that have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic, will be critical to restoring economic growth and helping economies withstand future shocks. We are pressing forward on our work on women's economic empowerment, including support for the implementation of the La Serena Roadmap on Women and Inclusive Growth, and to better understand the economic impacts of structural barriers to women's economic participation. We have been working night and day, literally night and day, because it is impossible to get all of the APEC economies onto a digital platform when it's not night for someone, to develop a new vision for APEC that once launched will provide direction for our work in APEC for decades to come. I'm going to touch in more detail on a few of our 2020 priorities and also the efforts that we've been taking to advance these priorities. So I'm going to start with trade and investment. APEC's work on trade and investment is APEC's central pillar, and we remain very active in proposing, supporting, and implementing many trade and investment initiatives, both during 2020 and beyond. On digital trade, our work includes encouraging economies to adhere to high standard digital trade principles and to commit to a permanent customs duty moratorium on electronic transmissions. We've also been holding a series of digital trade policy dialogues that bring together APEC economies, businesses, and academia to discuss key issues in the digital economy, such as the free flow of data and regulatory standards and the evolution of digital trade agreements. On services liberalization, our work centers on strong support to expand APEC's Services Index as a means to create a policy and regulatory environment that is conducive to open and competitive markets for services. On trade facilitation, we've been leading 3 capacity-building programs aimed at helping economies fully implement their WTO trade facility agreement obligations, to reduce wait times and costs at the border, and to simplify customs procedures. Meaningful action on trade facilitation is also fundamental to ensuring the flow of essential goods and services to respond to COVID-19. Moving to the digital economy, the United States is pursuing a few new and innovative work streams in APEC that aim to leverage digital technologies to respond to and recover from COVID-19. As I noted earlier, the pandemic has brought into sharp focus the importance to all of us of digitization, cross-border data flows, and data privacy. So I'm going to highlight a few new areas of work on the digital economy. First is our project that seeks to promote innovative telehealth solutions across APEC. We are doing an APEC-wide review focused on case studies that can highlight best practices in what is an evolving policy environment that to help to promote and increase access to telehealth solutions during and following COVID-19. In particular, the study is looking at how APEC can identify and reduce barriers in the telehealth industry. Second, we are also supporting a project to highlight cybersecurity risk management policies that can help prevent massive economic and business disruptions, especially as many companies and governments make unprecedented shifts to virtual operations using digital technologies due to the pandemic. To this end, the United States plans to host a virtual cybersecurity policy roundtable early next year for economies, industry, and other stakeholders to share resources and best practices on cybersecurity risk management. We hope to start a conversation on what APEC can do going forward with industry and economies to facilitate trade in the region. And then finally, the United States is leading a discussion aimed at globalizing the cross-border privacy rules system and allowing equal participation by non-APEC members through the establishment of the Cross-Border Privacy Rules System, or CBPR, in a standalone forum. Taking a bit of a shift, one of our top priorities for APEC remains supporting women's economic empowerment across the region. And we are currently working across economies in Sub-4 to move these efforts forward. I'll highlight some of our key efforts. In 2019, under Chile's leadership, APEC launched the La Serena Roadmap on Women and Inclusive Growth, an effort we support strongly and that aligns with our goals to the White House-led Women's Global Development and Prosperity, or WGDP, initiative. This year, we are finalizing the implementation plan for the roadmap, which will require, among other things, that all APEC Sub-4 work plans include women's economic empowerment into their programs. A U.S.-led partnership between the Small and Medium Enterprises Working Group and the Policy Partnership on Women in the Economy led to the creation of a Women in E-Commerce Toolkit, which aims to support female entrepreneurs. We are also supporting efforts on structural reform and women's empowerment under the Economic Committee to better identify the legal and regulatory barriers to women's economic participation and understand their economic impacts. Structural barriers to women's economic participation have been magnified during the pandemic. As, for example, women frequently bear the lion's share of teaching children during a digital school environment, frequently while trying to work full-time jobs themselves. These barriers and the need to place women at the center of recovery efforts were referred to in the recently adopted Women in the Economy Forum statement. Moving to structural reform, the United States continues to push ahead with long-term work to improve the investment climate and the business regulatory environment in the region. APEC's work on structural reform will be critical to restoring economic growth and helping economies withstand future shocks. We are pleased that the Economic Committee has endorsed the third phase of the U.S.-sponsored Ease of Doing Business initiative. We have and will continue to adapt this workstream to help economies respond to the economic challenges from the pandemic. We continue to work with APEC economies to further improve good regulatory practices in the area of stakeholder consultation and rulemaking. And looking ahead to next year, we have a few exciting projects planned. In response to feedback and input from industry, we are launching a project on digital permitting, which is designed to help economies use digital tools to improve the issuance of government licenses and permits. Additionally, the United States will be hosting a workshop on developing a modern credit infrastructure by implementing internationally recognized legal frameworks and best practices. The COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated the need to support business operations, including by extending credit, and has brought a sharp focus on the need to assess the effect of modern technologies on legal structures for secured credit. Turning to human capital development, research suggests the world risks a growing shortage of digitally skilled workers, including in the APEC region. And I'm going to take a bit of exception to something that Matt said in his opening remarks. I do not think APEC is a small organization. When 60% of the global workforce lives and works in the APEC region. And to that end, our APEC Closing the Digital Skills Gap report seeks to ensure economies are creating policies for workforce development consistent with the digital future, particularly in light of COVID-19 impacts on the workforce. Finally, under Malaysia's leadership, we are very close to finalizing negotiations on the post-2020 vision. Throughout the negotiations, we have been focused on delivering a concise and high-level vision that focuses on APEC's role in the future, facilitating trade and investment across the region, as well as using technology and innovation as drivers for strong economic growth. The goal is for leaders to endorse the vision on November 20th. The endorsement of this vision is this year's signature APEC deliverable, which we hope will send an important signal of APEC's continued importance over the next few decades to fostering trade and investment and income generation in the Asia Pacific. I want to thank you again for your time, and I look forward to the conversation this morning, including how APEC can support economic recovery in the region during and post-COVID-19. Thank you very much. Bill, I can't hear you.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I muted myself, which is follow instructions and then forgot to unmute. Thank you very much, Sandra. Much appreciated. As I told all of you, she's going to stay on for the panel. So if you have questions, submit them to the chat line, and we'll make sure there's an opportunity to get to them later on. Let me now introduce the panel, and they'll be speaking in the order that I'm going to introduce them. First, we have Rosemary Banks, who is New Zealand's ambassador to the United States. She has had a lengthy career in New Zealand's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, including permanent representative of New Zealand to the United Nations in New York, ambassador to France, ambassador to Portugal, and New Zealand's permanent representative to the OECD, as well as numerous other missions. Her presence here is particularly important because next year's host of APEC is going to be New Zealand. And so we're looking for Ambassador Banks to talk to us about what her government has planned for 2021, just as we've just heard some things about what is planned for 2020. Next, we have Kurt Tong, who I think is probably well known to many of you that are listening. He is the former Consul General, Chief of Mission in Hong Kong and Macau, former Principal at DAS for Economic and Business Affairs at State, former Ambassador for Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, and currently a partner at the Asia Group. Kurt has a long history of diplomatic activity in most of the countries of Asia, and including specifically, as I said, a turn as ambassador for APEC in 2011. Next, we have Sarah English, who is the Vice President of Global Public Policy at MasterCard. She has a lengthy career at MasterCard. In her current capacity, she's responsible for leading the company's global trade agenda and leading advocacy strategies for major trade negotiations, including TPP, TISA, TTIP, and other investment treaties. And I'm hoping one of these days you can be involved in one that's successful, rather than the ones that are listed in your resume, which have so far not exactly come out the way that many of us wanted them to come out. In any event, we're glad to have Sarah with us, and we're particularly happy to have a representative from a company that is very much involved in the digital space, talking about what's going on in APEC from their perspective. Finally, batting cleanup, we have another person who's well known to all APEC aficionados, and that's Monica Whaley, who is president of the National Center for APEC and has been associated with NSC APEC really from its founding. So she's a veteran of APEC issues and a veteran of the National Center for APEC going back a long way. And so we're very happy to have her. This event would not be complete without Monica's involvement, and I'm particularly grateful to her for helping us put it together, for co-hosting it with us, and for helping us come up with the panel that we've got. So with that, let me turn it over to Ambassador Banks, and then we'll proceed through the panel, and then we'll have a conversation and go to questions. So, Ambassador.
Well, thank you, Bill, and thank you for the opportunity to join this panel, being with such good friends. APEC is certainly top of mind for New Zealand at the moment, and not just because we're the proud host next year, but because for us it is a really important organisation. Just looking back, it was 1999 when we last hosted APEC, and that too was a somewhat difficult year. The region was coming out of the impact of the Asian financial crisis. So it seems like we've got something of a knack for landing difficult years. It does seem that when we host again next year for the second time, we'll still all be dealing with the economic, the social, and the health impacts of COVID-19. However, despite those challenges, hosting APEC for us is a unique and timely opportunity for us to show that we're ready and willing to step up and show some regional leadership. We want to do all we can to advance and to sustain APEC, to keep up its momentum on trade and economic policy work, and that's all the more needed now, as the Deputy Assistant Secretary has just covered, in this period of needing to find ways to recover from COVID. Later, I can give you some indications of how we will be approaching our year, but it's relatively early days in the sense that we've just had an election in New Zealand, and so we haven't really yet had the opportunity to run our key goals for the APEC chairing year past our new ministers. We're also very conscious that the APEC, the Malaysian year, hasn't yet finished, and as we've just heard, there are some very important meetings still to come to set the future direction for APEC. But setting aside for the moment the policy priorities that New Zealand would have for 2021, I'll just focus on the logistics, because this too is going to be very different. For the first time ever, we will be hosting virtual APEC the entire year. So instead of welcoming people to New Zealand, which we were really looking forward to doing, we're going to be instead arranging hundreds and hundreds of international virtual meetings, bringing together people across 21 economies and a number of different time zones. So I know all of my colleagues are going to be working day and night, literally, on that too. As well as those formal meetings, we'll be hosting international media conferences, we'll be supporting APEC, and also the CEO Summit and the Voices of the Future Youth Forum. We're doing our best to pick up the wisdom and experience that we can from this year's running of virtual meetings by the others, the G20, ASEAN, UN agencies. So as far as possible, we'll make sure that our delegates get a best experience that they can. One advantage of the digital world might be that the meetings will be shorter, and definitely they'll have to be very focused and keep to time. So just at the big picture level, for the many economies that are united by the Pacific Ocean, there really has never been a more important time for us to all join together. Turbulent times are known in history to produce innovation, invention, and creativity. So I know it's really hard to find anything good to say about a pandemic, but we're hoping that this will be at least a catalyst to help us when our APEC members all come together next year to tackle our work with really renewed energy. Now, before I hand over to the next panelist, I'd also just like to thank the National Centre for APEC for the recommendations paper that they've prepared for New Zealand for next year. We'll be certainly attending closely to that and giving it a lot of thought. So happy to come back later to a bit more on the policy side, but thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Kurt.
Thank you, Bill, and good afternoon, everybody. Just picking up the cue from Bill's introduction of me, which made me sound like I'm about 700 years old. Let me back out a little bit in terms of time frame and just say a couple things about APEC as it stands now, and maybe about the next several years. It's a great organization. Sandra's right. It's bigger than people think. It does a lot of things. It has become part of the fabric of intellectual discourse in the Asia Pacific about economic policy and about what countries can do together to make themselves more prosperous and more stable. Great organization. It's had some tough years. Okay, so this year is a COVID year where there's going to be a virtual meeting and things are being put together, creatively, but kind of jury rigged around what was expected to be a more sort of typical set piece type APEC year in terms of meetings and agenda and the like. The year before, there was no leaders meeting at all because of the crisis in Chile, and the year before that, there was a rather difficult one in Papua New Guinea, which, it was a difficult thing for Papua New Guinea, given its resources, to chair such a complex organization, and the results kind of flowed from that. So it's kind of been a dry period for APEC, and the question is whether, given the overlay of U.S.-China conflict, the degradation of the consensus around proper globalization, can APEC really play a vital role in knitting things together and helping create a more successful interaction among the economies of the Asia Pacific? I think the answer is yes, but I think it's going to take some really hard work and determined and maybe not very APEC-ish, but more aggressive approaches from some of the leading members, including the United States. I think there's a couple things that one can do, and I'm thinking and hoping that New Zealand will get this started, despite this also being a COVID year in 2021, as the ambassador outlined. One is to just have people put resources into the organization. The United States should raise its hand immediately and say, we want to host it at the first possible opportunity. That may be 2023, and if other smaller countries are also raising their hand for that year, the U.S. should be a little bit aggressive and just say, okay, this is our opportunity in an administration before an election year. We want to do this, and just take that role. And the United States and other countries that step up to host can adopt a very results-oriented approach to getting things done, accomplishing objectives, and the net result may just be that the world treads water in terms of acceptable, mutually beneficial, and politically resilient globalization. But that in itself would be progress. The second thing is to choose an agenda which is forward-looking and looks at the emerging issues rather than spending a lot of time on past issues. And many of those were discussed by Sandra. I thought the agenda that she outlined is quite robust. I would put a particular emphasis on digital issues and a digital policy agenda. Now, clearly, this is a very divisive thing because there are a range of views within APEC about privacy, about freedom of expression, about data localization, national security, and the like. But they should still be addressed head on. And APEC is a forum where you can pursue these questions and really try and accomplish some forward motion and come up with some rules that reflect the interests of the Americas and Asia, the Pacific, and then try and hopefully knit some of that together with Europe as well down the road. And I think that it's a combination on the digital agenda in particular of doing APEC initiatives, but then being also willing to do non-APEC initiatives that have similar content. So I would be a strong advocate of the US and Japan expanding their digital services agreement to multiple APEC members, and then have that be actively discussed within the confines of APEC, just as TPP and RCEP have been discussed in the APEC context, and really drive that agenda aggressively forward. I could also see setting up a public-private working group specifically on digital issues that creates an opportunity. You could get the Western firms involved in the digital space on various perspectives on things like privacy, because there are various perspectives. Get them involved, and then tempt the Chinese firms to participate. And they may choose not to do so, but the offering would always be there, and have that be something where the digital policy agenda is enriched by direct participation by the private sector. So just some thoughts about the energy level and some of the agenda items that might be useful for APEC going forward.
Thank you.
Sarah, go ahead.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you to CSIS and NC APEC for having me on such a distinguished panel. I think I need to update my resume because USMCA was a success, so I should add that in there. But you know, through APEC and meetings like this, you know, it's really becoming the norm now to have these virtual meetings. And thanks to the speed and reliability of digital services and technology, we're able to do so. And these are really technology platforms, and digital enabled services are so critical to the digital economy. How we access, how we share and secure that system is becoming really challenged. And that's really at the heart of what MasterCard does. You know, Matt mentioned APEC was the Rodney Dangerfield. I like to say that trade and services is the Rodney Dangerfield of trade. You know, globally, so the services sector is growing faster, 60% faster even, than the manufacturing sector. And it really provides more widespread economic opportunity, and it's especially done so in the pandemic, as we have all seen, with small businesses going online in terms of overnight, citizens getting paid through digital payments. But more broadly, the connection from declining goods in trade points less to a decline in globalization than really to a shift to global data flows. And increasingly, these are important drivers of connectivity and trade. And as we see it, as these manufacturing value chains mature, services are really becoming increasingly sourced globally as businesses seek best-in-class inputs to maintain this overall competitiveness. But in companies like ours, we really need open infrastructure, and we need standards, standardization of services in the same way that the roads were built and the railroads were built for manufacturing industries to flourish. But today's laws and regulations are really quickly becoming fractured. Unfortunately, we're seeing this increase of fragmentation of laws and standards, especially in the digital space. And this leads to increasingly, it does not lead to interoperability, which is something that businesses like ours really need to operate. So in this modern economy, when we see it, is data is really the critical driving force behind all of these issues. And it could solve issues like climate, cyber, and inclusion. But there really is a lack of political will to solve it. And we see that data flows and privacy are really at the nexus. So some things that we've been thinking about and pushing for, and I like Kurt's idea of this technology alliance or leadership, where we can bring in the private sector, but also have some kind of cooperation amongst national regulators. So we can start to build principles and consensus around some of these things, not just data, but AI and cyber, to really drive more cooperation, more connectivity, and commercial interoperability. And at the regional level, things like APEC CBPR really try to bridge the difference between privacy and the participating economies by encouraging interoperability. And we like to see more of that. And I'm really pleased to see that Malaysia's year, as well as past years, are really focusing on the digital economy and the issues on the agenda. I think together, if we have this shared objective going forward, will really help protect, but also enable innovation to make the global marketplace much more agile, much more inclusive, and much more resilient than ever before. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Monica? You're on mute.
There we go. I knew it would do that. Sorry about that. Thank you, Bill, and thanks to CSIS. This is always an annual program that we look forward to at NC APEC, and we're delighted to be able to help bring it into being. It's a great panel again this year, so thanks to everybody for agreeing to serve and be questioned and all the things we're going to do on the panel. Really, batting cleanup means that everybody else has said most of the things that need to be said, which I love. But the one thing I wanted to sort of, it became clear during the comments, but the role of the private sector in APEC is really something pretty unique. And there is an institutional piece of APEC that is the APEC Business Advisory Council, known as ABAC within APEC. And it really has a parallel structure almost to the government structure. We, like as Sandra mentioned early in the year, they were able to meet in person early on in the year, and also ABAC was able to meet for its first meeting in Australia in early February, and actually many of the senior officials were able to come and join us there for a dialogue there. So there's, right from the beginning of the year throughout all of the ministerial meetings and the various working group meetings and all until the very end of the year when the leaders meet, that the APEC Business Advisory Council really does have a channel into the APEC official process. And this year, a lot of its efforts obviously focused, they came out with a special report on COVID fairly early in the year. And then we also did an important document on AI and one on privacy. And we also had a chance to put, from the ABAC, to put put some ideas into this APEC vision statement, so that when hopefully a vision statement of some sort is finalized, that it really does capture what the business community wants to see in Asia Pacific as an outcome, which is, you know, a dynamic, seamless, resilient, inclusive, and sustainable Asia Pacific region, and that a place where people can do business seamlessly. And that is something actually that a notion that the U.S. actually started back in 2011 when we were chairs. We talked a lot about this seamless commercial environment, which we hope to be the long-term goal of APEC. So there's a lot going on, and I know that, Bill, we're going to get to some of your questions, but I just wanted to start with that, and that my angle will probably mostly be this private sector element, because I think it does really bring a richness and a practicality to APEC that is unique, and it provides positive momentum to some of these issues. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks to all of you. We've got one question in the queue so far, so I'll just remind the audience that if you've got questions, now is the time to send them in. And the fact that we've got one proves that yes, indeed, the technology works. It can be done. So I'd encourage the rest of you. But let me start with a couple questions of my own. We've talked a good bit about digital issues and digital trade issues, and several of you, in fact, I think probably all of you, have mentioned that in some form. And we do seem to be moving into an era where we may be facing fragmentation of the internet, because we've got large economies, China being one, the EU being another, that have taken very different approaches in some respects. And I think I'd like to have some of the panelists comment, or all of them for that matter, comment on what role APEC can play in the trying to stave off fragmentation. APEC has the advantage of a diverse membership, including some that are deeply involved in this issue. To say that there's a diverse set of views on issues like privacy, data localization, and security would be an understatement. There are sharply different views amongst some of the economies, at least. Are there areas of convergence out there that APEC members can take advantage of to prevent further fragmentation? Is APEC a place or a pathway that we can look to try to overcome some of these differences? Anybody want to take a crack at that?
I can.
Good. Go ahead, Sarah.
You know, I'd be remiss not to mention TPP, and I know the U.S. is not a party of TPP, but if you see the work that was done in the digital trade chapter in TPP, it lives on in USMCA, and parts of it are living on in other agreements like the DEPA. So I think if there's one area of convergence, it's really digital trade. You see it in the US-Japan agreement. So I'm hoping and wondering, maybe in the next couple of years, we can see more sectoral agreements, or this intersection of sectoral and regional agreements, especially in APEC, because there does seem to be some convergence on these digital issues. And we already have something like CBPR that really helps with the issue of transfer mechanisms for data flows. But I do think and I do hope that there is some convergence there going forward.
Who would like to talk about, well, first, does anybody want to add anything to that?
No, only that I would just say that from the ABAC's perspective, we very much agree with what Sarah just said, that, ABAC at first this year, when the COVID pandemic first hit, I think looked at really practical things like digital identifications and e-signatures. It's just a really practical way to keep business flowing in this very difficult new environment. And then piling onto that were issues of privacy. So then you say, well, how do we tackle privacy? It's become all the more urgent in this digital environment, and the economies that maybe before weren't picturing exactly how the whole digitization change, all these changes would really make changes to their economy. They see it fully now, I think, and have been coming aboard. So things like the ABAC's pushing on privacy to, for APEC to revisit the privacy framework that they already have and modernize it and bring it up to speed. And then using the already existing work on the good regulatory practices work and apply that, doing regulatory impact assessments and things on privacy regulation. I think there's ways that APEC can take some of these issues and boil them down to some very practical things that really smooth the path for bringing things together and keeping them from getting so fragmented, as you suggested.
Just a last word, since we're chairing next year, very conscious of the complexity of dealing with this range of issues in APEC or anywhere. But, as we touched on earlier, APEC is the ideal body to just keep the dialogue and look at those practical areas that Monica has just listed. So we certainly see this as an area to keep our best efforts on for next year.
Well, let me follow up on that. We've gotten a couple questions now from the audience on CBPR and referring particularly, Sandra, to something that you said. So I'll put you on the spot a little bit since it was your comment. You had mentioned the possibility of moving CBPR to a separate forum and inviting countries from outside APEC to join. Can you talk a little bit more about that and how to operationalize that, and what barriers, challenges might the people that want to do that encounter as they try to move it beyond APEC?
Good. Thank you very much. So, I think everyone acknowledges the benefits of facilitating cross-border data flows and promoting common data privacy standards. The challenge is, how do you implement this? And we have been engaged in a extraordinarily detailed conversation with the other APEC economies that belong to CBPR for the last several months, since kind of the fairly early stages of the pandemic. And I think that the challenge to making this operational, since I apparently can't speak English anymore, and really comes from, how do we set up the rules? How do we make it attractive to others to join? how do we do this in a way that doesn't create a huge sort of administrative or bureaucratic kind of hangover, but at the same time have those structures in place that allow the system to kind of grow and develop and attract other new members. So certainly one of the challenges that CBPR has faced in its current kind of APEC iteration is that take up by companies and by economies has been fairly limited. And so one of the great things about APEC is that it is a laboratory for innovation. Certainly, having a concept kind of grow inside APEC, then launch into the wider world is something that's happened before. How we necessarily do this is definitely one of those devil is in the details, but if we have companies out there that have thoughts, we would love to put you in touch with the team that's working on this now. Thank you.
Anybody else want to add anything to that?
I would just say that on CBPR, Sandra is exactly right. This is a real chicken and egg situation. That it needs to have enough countries involved and it needs to have enough companies involved to sort of reach a critical mass to really become operational and dynamic, and it will also bring the costs down for companies, because that's been a real challenge, a barrier, that it costs so much. So there's some things APEC's working on now, kind of a on-ramp or sister program called the Privacy Recognition for Processors, which is something that basically makes the certification more accessible to small and medium enterprises, and they're trying to think about ways to get over those hurdles, but it is something where it has to become attractive enough to companies that they would spend the time and the money to become certified, and that also makes it more attractive for a greater number of economies to join in. So it's all going to come together, but it's taking a while.
Let's switch gears for a moment. I'm going to continue with audience questions because they're better than mine. And so we need to squeeze a number of these in. We've got an interesting one. This is more of a process question than a policy question. So I'll probably see if Sandra or Ambassador Banks wants to, looking ahead, wants to deal with it. It's from Lauren Moriarty from the Asia Foundation, who says, much APEC work and consensus building on key issues has traditionally been done on the margins of APEC meetings. Can you elaborate on what you think will be the impact of meeting virtually this year rather than in person? And in the future, how can APEC's experience in blending virtual and in-person collaboration on initiatives inform the future work program? How do you get things done when you're having a negotiation when you're doing it on Zoom, in other words?
It is really hard. It's really hard. It requires a very strong chair to sort of guide the process, to know when to kind of let everyone speak their piece and sort of get their policy statement out there, and then when to sort of play that kind of shuttle diplomacy role, which is truly exhausting. Having individual meetings with us, having individual meetings with others, if, trying to broker an agreement and then kind of presenting it to the whole group, it has been a challenge. I think when we started the digital, when we first moved to a digital platform and first started having digital meetings, we were really just doing plenaries. And it was fairly stilted. Very rapidly, the APEC economies, ourselves included, started having kind of formal bilateral meetings via Zoom or WebEx or whatever. And that helped a lot. I think the thing that is still missing is that kind of late night standing in a corner talking together, which is very, very difficult to proxy. I would say I think Malaysia is doing quite a good job. But I think the other thing that's key, and the piece of advice that I have for New Zealand, is everything takes much, much longer than it does when you're actually negotiating face to face. So starting early, and having a qualifying the level of ambition for the text. Shorter texts are easier to negotiate because and it sounds quite silly, but there are fewer words in them, so there are fewer words that people can object to. So short, concise texts, starting early, garnering that consensus early, I think is the path forward for the next year or so.
So, Ambassador, you're going to take her advice?
Yes, we're very happy to take advice from everybody. I mentioned earlier that we're picking up as many lessons as we can. We're very conscious of the challenges of trying to do negotiating virtually. I think that's the big problem now across the board with any kind of diplomacy or any area. In fact, on Monday, I'm going to have a conversation with my counterpart, my colleague, who's our New Zealand ambassador at the United Nations. If you think it's difficult in APEC with 21 economies, it's 193 countries that they're trying to work with. And the negotiating part is exactly as difficult as Sandra has just outlined it. So we're happy to take advice from anybody who's got it and who's got good experience. Thank you.
We've now got a couple questions about digital related, but moving off in slightly different directions. Mark Mealy from the U.S. ASEAN Business Council asked, what's the potential of APEC becoming the global alternative perspective on digital service taxes compared to or in relation to or in contrast to the European perspective? Is this anything that's being addressed or talked about? Should it be?
I am going to have to take that back. I do not know what if anything, we've done on digital services taxes.
Yeah, I'll jump in on that. I think that it is there's potential there. Whether you can get all 21 to agree to something that it has a lot of detail and firmness on it, I don't know. But I think it's a ripe territory and certainly would be a valuable conversation to have along with the other digital issues that were discussed. Kind of going back to the digital piece. One of the discussion points I think was around whether CBPR should be moved from APEC or negotiated outside APEC in order to make it more attractive, get more members. And that may be a mischaracterization of what's being considered, but I would think that it's important to continue to use APEC, but not exclusively use APEC on important initiatives like that. And just as an operating philosophy, try to shorten, and make more precise the agenda both inside and outside, particularly in the current environment and when addressing some of these difficult issues. Like the discussion about shortening texts is a good one, because if your way of getting to consensus is to have everybody's little thing in a text, you never get anywhere. And the other pitfall in APEC is to go for the least common denominator, something that pleases everyone. And so it's a balancing act that Sandra and others have to accomplish of driving forward a really substantive agenda and then knowing when to try and harvest it just among a group of the APEC economies, or move it outside, or do a combination of inside and outside. The APEC has these great strengths. It has a presumption of openness, right? And it has private sector participation, which is rather unique among international organizations, even economic ones. And making use of that makes great sense. But not being bound to the consent, not being completely constricted by the consensus approach is important at the same time. So this tax thing, maybe it's a great idea, maybe it's not, but pushing it in, seeing how it goes, and then figuring out what's the right way forward is the way to go for it.
Yeah, I just comment. I mean, most of that activity is going on in the OECD, so there is another place where the issue has a home. Whether it needs another home is kind of an interesting question. The OECD is running into some difficulties, but it's a lot of the same people that are also in APEC. So I'm not sure that there would be a a huge difference, but it's an interesting
Well,
question.
there's I don't know, Bill. I mean, there's a whole lot of economies in APEC that are not in the OECD, and that you want to do business with. So if you can pick off a couple 100 million person economies on that agenda and get them to become like-minded with the United States using APEC, rather than waiting for the perfect solution, debating with the latte drinking Europeans and the OECD, maybe that's a good way to do it.
Well, I believe in this negotiation, it's not just the OECD members that are involved. Something in the back of my mind says there's a lot more countries that are participating,
Okay.
Which kind of makes sense because it's about revenue, and it's very hard to find a government that's not interested in more revenue, which is at least one part of what the negotiation is about, to the chagrin of the business community. But if you're a government, involved in this, the issue is we need more revenue, and here's a place to get it because, in our view, they're undertaxed. That's it. We could have a debate about that, but you make a good point. I think there's a number of members of APEC that are probably not involved or are not very substantively involved, and it might bring a different perspective. Another one also, sort of pointing off in a different direction. Question comes from Stephen Clays from Pfizer. How can APEC further support and facilitate the WTO e-commerce negotiations? Anybody have any thoughts about that? Those are also moving along. That's I guess, best to be described as a plurilateral. I think there's now 75 countries that are involved in this, in the e-commerce negotiations. I'm sure some of them are APEC countries. Any thoughts about that?
So this is Sandra. I think it's important to note that APEC doesn't really have a role inside WTO negotiations. Where APEC has played a really helpful role is after the WTO has reached agreements in helping APEC member economies fulfill the terms of those agreements. Like, for instance, the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement. So we do a lot of kind of technical assistance and capacity building related to ensuring that APEC member economies are capable of fulfilling their obligations under the WTO. And to go back to the previous question, I've just confirmed that APEC is not currently doing work on digital services taxes.
Well, that was efficient. The advantage of virtual meeting, you can send somebody an email while the rest of us are talking. That's terrific.
They're just listening to us and they're sending me emails. So
right, even better. I'm glad to see that we've got an audience. People are paying attention. I think the other thing that is attractive about APEC, and several of you alluded to this earlier, is that it's also somewhere between a laboratory and a safe space for creative solutions. It's a place, because they're not negotiating legal obligations, but they're negotiating best practices and cooperative approaches. It's an opportunity to experiment a little bit, see how things work. I think that leads to some of these questions, which are, because it is a bit of a laboratory, maybe they have some fresh thinking that they can provide that you're not going to see in either the WTO or the OECD, which are going to take a much more of a traditional institutional approach to these things. Or not, I don't know. Here's a political question, if you will, which is probably for Sandra, because it's about the U.S. Although you can you can dodge it if you want. It's from Martin Zubko, who's a PhD student at Metropolitan University in Prague. So we have a global audience, and the question is: have deteriorated relations between the U.S. and China affected APEC activities, especially future institutional policies that are generally acceptable to the APEC members? Is APEC having trouble because of the difficulties we have with China right now, or have we been able to get beyond that?
I would say that by and large, APEC focuses on a very broad range of issues, but all of us worked very hard to not introduce bilateral tensions into APEC-related discussions. So we have this vast nomenclature and all sorts of rules. We can't wear flag pins. We can't have maps up behind us when we speak. And we talk about economies, not about governments. And I think that has successfully, over the last several decades, really insulated APEC from a lot of bilateral tension. And I'd be interested in Kurt's perspective as well, and also Ambassador Banks, because I think she worked on APEC when New Zealand hosted the first time. I think over the years, APEC has managed to be not just a safe space for kind of non-binding innovation, but also a safe space for discussion where we keep bilateral tensions to the side.
Kurt or Ambassador Banks, either one of you want to comment? Kurt?
I mean, I found it quite, there was a lot of tough conversations with Chinese counterparts in APEC. And I don't think that surprises anyone to hear that. And I completely agree with Sandra that there are ground rules that keep the gloves on in the conversations. And that's useful so that you don't have blow-ups that could become, although there's some rare circumstances where it's happened, like in Papua New Guinea, but where you kind of stay within a certain set of playing rules and then work the best you can to reach outcomes. There's any number of initiatives where China's the holdout and is trying to rally just a handful of countries to speak for them to try and block useful initiatives, and that's just the reality of APEC. And some people then hear that and they think, well, why bother to use APEC if we can't? But that's why it's useful, because the number one counterparty to the United States right now in terms of economic policy philosophy is at the table. And you've got a chance to engage them with a lot of other people kind of witnessing the debate. And that can be quite useful on any number of issues, I think.
I don't know if there are any cat owners out there, but when you take cats to the vet to stay overnight or whatever, they don't fight when they're on neutral territory. And I think that's been the real value of APEC over the years. We've lived through, during its lifetime, a number of tensions between or amongst members, and because of that set of protocols and understandings, and also the value that all of the members have been prepared to attribute to having that neutral discussion space where it sometimes was very valuable to be able to meet in an APEC context. I think that remains a very useful forum for all of us.
Well, as a cat owner, I have to say I'm not sure I agree with the analogy. They may not fight on neutral territory, but they certainly resist going. It's a struggle to get them into the little basket. But what about, well, let's go for a couple more minutes and then we're going to have to stop, I'm afraid. But what about RCEP? One of the things that has happened is that the RCEP, what I think people are hoping will be the final, well, not the final, but the meeting that will then permit everybody to sign on. The RCEP meeting has begun today. There are a few loose ends to tie up, I'm told. I don't think we need to go into what they are, but let's assume that there's an RCEP agreement. Let's assume that it's without India, which seems to be the current situation. Doesn't look that that's going to change near term. Is that going to, how is that going to relate to APEC? Is that going to replace APEC as the institution in Asia that's going to deal with economics, or are they going to sort of coexist, or are they going to do different things? Does anybody have thoughts about that? Well, okay. It's hard to see. I'll have a thought then, in the absence of, since you guys have let me down. It's hard to it's hard to see a replacement. It's not, the membership is not identical. And if you focus on RCEP, you leave out a lot of Pacific partners, including the United States, that I think would very much welcome being part of the APEC process. So I'm not sure that that in the end is going to make much difference. It's going to be a trade agreement, and a modest one at that. I don't think it's going to be a successor or replacement. We've got a couple more, and then and I think one of them has really been answered by in DAS Oudkirk's remarks, but I'm going to ask you again anyway, just if you can summarize, because we're being asked, this is a question from a journalist, what are your expectations from a trade perspective for next week's meetings? Will there be any meaningful deliverables, and what would they look like?
Great. So as I noted in my prepared remarks, I believe that the primary deliverable will be we hope, the endorsement of the post-2020 vision, which will set a framework for APEC work going forward for the next 20 years. So that's really the primary that's been the primary focus of negotiations over the last several weeks. And as I noted earlier, we are in we're very, very close to an agreement, but aren't quite there yet.
Okay, excellent. I think the last question, unless another one comes in, and this is probably, it's kind of an essay question, so I'm not sure we really have time for it, but if somebody wants to say something short, that would be good. We have a graduate student at Harvard asking, how do data and privacy agreements in APEC, in the APEC region differ from those in Europe? I'm not sure anybody's brave enough to tackle that because it's kind of an exam question, you know, more than it is an event question. But does anybody want to take a stab at it, Monica?
Definitely an exam question, not an event question. But if your questioner wants to send us his or her email address, we would be happy to put them in touch with one of our subject matter experts who can go into excruciating detail on this.
Well, yeah. I can tell you it's excruciating. Monica?
No, I was only going to add, it sort of builds on to your last question about RCEP. APEC's unique feature, one of its many unique features is that it is a consensus-based organization, and a lot of things get done actually by sort of peer pressure. I mean, things like the APEC business travel card, you know, we received the peer pressure when everybody else was on it to find a way to be transitional members of it. These kinds of agreements that's why APEC can't, I don't think, be replaced by RCEP, which is going to be an agreement and something they all sign on to. APEC allows this test kitchen laboratory sort of opportunity for some of these different issues, and it doesn't have to be treaty based, and a lot of the things in Europe are much more sort of treaty based and worked out that way. So I think that's one of the major differences.
Thank you. I'm glad somebody finally was brave enough to step into that one. Going back to the difference between Europe and APEC, Patrick McLaren, who asked a question, if you would follow up, send your email to Jasmine Lim, who's our technical host for this event. She can pass your email address on, if you wish, to the State Department, and they will get back to you, as Sandra said, in excruciating detail. You may be sorry you asked, but on the other hand, I'm sure it'll be a good answer. I think a good set of questions, and an interesting one, interesting ones that I think allowed us to talk a little bit about the potential for APEC and the way it works, but also to delve a little bit into the digital space issues, which is very much at the front, on the front burner, both for the meeting coming up next week, but also I think from what Ambassador Banks said in New Zealand's agenda as well. And the only comment I'd make in conclusion is that they should be, because we are in a state right now where countries are moving in different directions on the internet. And I think have always thought that CBP, on the privacy front, CBPR is a good thing to look at to try to square some of the circles that are out there on privacy, perhaps not all of them. And that APEC is a good place to look when you're trying to tackle some of these other difficult issues. So it's a good thing it's on the agenda, and it's a good thing that we may be able to make some progress on it both this year and next.
Bill,
So,
could I just encourage your audience also? A lot of these issues are going to be gone into in greater depth and from different angles at next week's APEC CEO Dialogues, which is actually without a charge. It's an open registration program, and we'd encourage people to look into it, APEC CEO Dialogues, and if the exact long website name is not coming to me right now, but it's been on Twitter. The National Center for APEC at NCAPEC has been tweeting out information about it. Happy to have people get to us for more information.
There we go. Major speakers are lined up for this event, senior speakers. And so if you want to continue your involvement in the issue, take Monica's advice, go to at NCAPEC and get the details and sign up. It is free. Which is always a good word. Okay, panelists, Sandra, does anybody want to make any closing comments before I thank you all and say goodbye? All right, in that case, I will thank you all and say goodbye. I appreciate you giving us the time. I think this was a good addition to our overall Asia architecture point of view, and you can be sure that we will do this again. As we've been doing it many years in the past. So I look forward to hopefully seeing all of you as well as some others the next time around. And Sandra, good luck next week. Ambassador, good luck to you next week as well if you're going to be participating. And thank you all, and to our audience, thank you all as well for joining us. Anything else?